Before we begin, there are a few technical items to note. We have simultaneous interpretation available. To select your preferred language, you will find a globe icon at the bottom of your screen for the interpretation, which you can use to select the language you'd like to listen to. Nous avons l'interprétation simultanée. Alors, pour sélectionner votre langue préférée, vous trouverez une icône représentant un globe terrestre au bas de votre écran. Cliquez dessus pour sélectionner la langue dans laquelle vous souhaitez écouter le webinaire. If you have any difficulties with the interpretation, closed captioning, or any other technical issues, please reach out to us in the chats and we'll do our best to help resolve them as quickly as possible. I am Solange Mudahogora, the ICN National Program Manager. On behalf of the ICN, I would like to welcome everyone to today's webinar. J'aimerais vous présenter brièvement le réseau de coordination des conseils. Le RCC est une coalition regroupant les 8 conseils provinciaux et régionaux pour la coopération internationale. Ces conseils luttent pour la promotion de la justice sociale et du changement social à travers le monde et représentent plus de 350 organisations de la société civile diverses à travers le pays, d'un océan à l'autre. Les conseils sont des leaders dans l'engagement du public et le réseau offre une plateforme nationale qui permet aux conseils de collaborer pour améliorer leur efficacité et identifier des priorités communes en matière d'action collective. Pour en savoir plus sur le travail du réseau, veuillez consulter notre site web ou nous suivre sur les médias sociaux. Before we delve into today's content, we would like to acknowledge that we are hosting this webinar in Mi'kmaq. This is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, Mi'kmaq, Lasakawak, Malasit, and Passamaquoddy peoples, first signed with the British Crown in 1726. We ask that we all consider this and the land on which we work as we participate in today's webinar. We feel it's important to keep this in mind and know and honor the land that we are on. The ICN works with many communities across Canada, including First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, as well as communities around the world in the international development sector. And we feel it's important to reflect on this, draw lessons from our colonial history, and how this history intersects in many ways with the issues we are facing today in working towards a more just, equitable, and sustainable world. You are invited to use the charts to introduce yourselves, where you are joining from, and comments on today's topic. Any harmful, disrespectful, or inappropriate language or comments will not be tolerated. You may also use the Q&A function later to address any question to the speaker. We will start with an introduction of speakers, then we will hear from the panelists, and end with a Q&A session. Today's webinar will be moderated by Sydney Pigot. Elle est une leader dans le domaine de l'impact social, une chercheuse et une militante pour l'équité des genres et la justice sociale à l'échelle mondiale. Elle est actuellement chargée de l'impact social chez Shopify, où elle mène des programmes d'éducation pour les jeunes sous-représentés dans le domaine de la technologie et de l'entrepreneuriat avec des partenaires du monde entier. Avant de se joindre à Shopify, elle a occupé des postes de direction chez Elevate et le YMCA Canada. Elle est également membre du comité consultatif du réseau Avenir Égalitaire. Sydney a présenté ses travaux sur l'équité du genre dans plusieurs forums internationaux, notamment la Commission des Nations Unies sur le statut des femmes, la conférence Women Deliver, la conférence de l'Union interparlementaire pour les jeunes parlementaires et le RightsCon. Elle apporte une perspective féministe intersectionnelle à tous ses travaux, inspirés par son fier héritage afro-antillais. Sydney, la parole est à vous.
Merci beaucoup, Solange, et bienvenue à tout le monde. Comme Solange a dit, on va avoir de l'interprétation pour la séance aujourd'hui, mais la conversation va être surtout en anglais. Si vous avez des questions, n'hésitez pas à les demander en français, mais pour aider pour l'interprétation, on va passer la conversation en anglais. So thank you very much for having me here. I'm so excited to be moderating this conversation with these absolutely incredible panelists today. I'm joining you from Treaty 13 territory with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, but also the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Wendat Nations and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Please do share where you're coming from in the chat. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce our three amazing speakers today. It's incredible that we have a speaker of only women, a panel of only women. I don't think this has happened to me in a really long time, so super excited for this conversation. To start, we have Amanda Hendry. Amanda Hendry is a deaf and disabled advocate who became motivated by the challenges of living with disabilities to work towards social change. She has an undergraduate degree in public policy and a certificate in nonprofit leadership from Mount St. Vincent University, which led her to work in nonprofit communications and programming. Amanda has previously done communications and programming for Reimagine 17 and was a 2023 ICN Youth Representative for the Atlantic Council for International Cooperation at the 67th session of the Commission on the Status of Women. She quickly learned the need for more awareness for limited access through communications, especially as she has a cochlear implant and hearing aid that impacts access to digital technologies if not considered in the process. Currently, she is the coordinator for the Nova Scotia League for Equal Opportunities, focusing on three pillars: the Quality of Life Index for Persons with Disabilities Initiative, International Day for Persons with Disabilities, and Access Awareness Week, Nova Scotia. We also have Lauren Roberts joining us. Lauren is currently the digital media specialist at the Manitoba Council for International Cooperation. She studied digital media design and videography at Red River Polytechnic in Winnipeg, graduating with honors. Lauren is passionate about sustainability, healing ecosystems, and gender equality. At MCIC, she works to support the team in both the digital and print space to connect Manitobans of all ages. In her spare time, Lauren likes to garden and learn about native prairie plants, play ultimate frisbee, read, and bike. She's always listening to excessively loud music while working and is surrounded by inspirational quotes, including one from Maya Angelou: "Do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better." Finally, we have Brianna Long. Brianna Parent-Long grew up on the islands of the Mi'kmaq people, specifically Papineau First Nation, Eel River Bar First Nations, and Listuguj First Nations, whose land she had the privilege to nurture and grow on. She is the feminist program coordinator at VIDEA and is passionate about gender equality, decolonization, protection from sexual exploitation and abuse, and sex worker advocacy. Brianna serves on DIGNA's advisory committee and is a board member at the Canadian Association of International Development Professionals. Also, Brianna is currently at Carleton University for her PhD in political science with an interest in feminist international relations. So, as you can see, an incredible panel that we have here. I just saw a note that we will have a poll that we will be running to get a little bit of information on where you're all coming from in terms of how you're using communications, AI, different technology in your work. So please do answer the poll so we'll be able to inform our conversation with our panelists here. And while you're answering that, I will get started with this incredible group. Our first question, a little bit challenging, but I think that it's a great panel to discuss this. It's around ethical communication. So, what do ethical communication practices for international solidarity entail? I'll start with Amanda for this question.
Thank you, Sydney, and I am so happy to be here today. I'm excited to get into this conversation. So this is actually a good question because it really depends on how you exactly view ethical communication based on what you see is in need and what you see your audience as. So from my point of view, the audiences that I typically interact with has more access needs, tend to have to do a little more consideration when it comes to, okay, do I keep their needs in mind knowing that it's not the same? Do I consider the different senses? Usually it's what happens. Like I am deaf, as Denny mentioned, so a lot of the times you have to do a little bit different. You can't just have a completely oral conversation and expect me to understand a single thing that anybody says. So a lot of the times when it comes to communications, it kind of have to have an understanding of like, okay, who are you talking to? In what ways will they understand the information? And in what ways do you need to present it? And what tools do you have at your disposal to be able to facilitate that conversation? And a lot of times when I think communication, I think of it as a conversation instead of a one-way street. So if I want to communicate with someone, a lot of times I don't know everything, or in most cases, I don't have the experience. So I need to like have another side of the conversation as well, the feedback to be able to be like, is this correct? Am I accessing you in a way that you feel comfortable, the way that is inclusive, in a way that you'll be able to understand the information without too much miscommunication? And usually it's misinterpretation due to the different language and the way that we perceive language. So in terms of ethical communication, a lot of times it's being transparent about where you are, being honest about what your position is, but then also being willing to be, okay, in this situation, I know not everyone able to access it digitally. I know not everyone able to access digitally in the same way. What exactly do I need to consider in order to communicate in a way that is both understanding of where people are at, but also in a little sense getting the information to people that makes sense to them? And that is the experience that I have, which is not even getting the information, let alone whether the information is inclusive, whether the information is relevant or acceptable to me in terms of language. And so that's another aspect of like the ethics side of it. Are we communicating in a way that, recognize where people are at? So that's kind of where I think ethical communication entails, like understanding the audience, being transparent about where you are, and being honest that you don't fully know everything, and being able to set the standard of being like, okay, I don't know everything. I'm reaching out saying that. Let me know, or I'll go look for it in the best way that I can. But yeah.
Absolutely love that, Amanda. Lauren, do you have any comments around ethical communication in your work?
Yeah, just first, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here and to be with this great group of panelists. I also want to mention I am joining from Winnipeg. We are a Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territories of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, Dene Nations, and the national homeland of the Métis people. In terms of our considerations for ethical communication practices, I really like how Amanda started that, right? It's like communication is this trying to be clear and concise and truthful and responsible. There's all those kind of things that come into it. I have found that there's like a few kind of great documents that I've come across in different times. One of them being the 10 Principles of Digital Storytelling, which is a link I'll try to drop in the chat for those of you that haven't seen it. But that was a great guideline for kind of anyone starting out in the international space for sure. But I think it's just kind of a great guideline for all digital media. And that's thinking about, you know, we all have biases and it's not my story. And consent is more than just paperwork. You know, it's continuing that two-way conversation that kind of Amanda alluded to as well, that whenever we're dealing with this communication space, we have to make sure it's that two-way conversation. A great kind of motive that I try to remember is nothing about us without us. And so even though, you know, we're trying to amplify someone's voice, we can't just take that interview and run, you know, making sure we're connecting back with them, reviewing things, making sure everyone's feeling comfortable that we're presenting them in the way that they want to be presented in. So ethical communication to me is really a lot about that conversation and that dialogue. Another great document that got a lot of news was the Oxfam Inclusive Language Guide that came out last March. And that has some great guidelines in it too, that kind of think about that ethical communication side, the power of language. And we always need to keep learning, right? So although those are just kind of two examples that maybe it's a good place to start for some people, we just have to keep reminding ourselves that we're constantly learning and we're growing and we're not going to be perfect, and trying to remember that and making sure that we're doing as much research as we can and we're exploring different avenues, and that as we learn more things, you know, we continue to grow and unlearn and continue that ethical kind of communication path. So maybe I'll drop those links in the chat for everyone.
That would be so helpful. We love resources here. It's always helpful to come back and be able to revisit that. It's also, we're talking about communication. Some people receive communication in different ways, need some time to settle with it afterwards. So any of the panelists, but also anyone attending, if you'd like to send resources in the chat, please do. We love to take those back and learn more. Brianna, do you have anything to share from your work?
Yeah, I think when I was thinking about this question, I was thinking more about my role in Communications at IDEA. So I'm one of several people that's responsible for formally relaying some of our key online and resource communications that are grounded in feminist, anti-capitalist, and decolonial narratives. But I'm not a quote unquote communications person, but rather I consider myself an advocate who's had the absolute pleasure to work with, sit with, listen to, and learn from my community of colleagues who offer a vast and beautiful account of what international solidarity means to them. And so when confronting communications, for example, I am able to tap into that and let it inform me. For example, Jennifer, who is a disability activist in our community, reminds us every day the importance and value of resistance in communications and the importance of using plain language and accessible resources. T, an Indigenous climate justice activist, reminds us that our communications are most powerful when they're utilizing powerful messages in a fun and creative way that isn't overly professionalized. And I think ethical communications is just that, it's plural. And while I have 4 things that I want to go through, I'm going to start with the last one, because I think that communications, as Amanda and Lauren were saying, need to be transparent. And I truly believe that perfection is a colonial expectation that stops genuine communication. Right now, I am reading from a fully typed out script, which I do before every speaking event, because due to my ADHD, I tend to speak in roundabout ways, which often reduces my confidence. So being able to have the questions in advance prepares and allows people to participate more and in the ways they want. And I think that being an expert is not in your ability to answer a question perfectly or say things perfectly, because mistakes are made, which is part of the learning process. And so acknowledging them and striving for improvement is central. But one of the key things in our organization is the importance of decentralizing communications. So it's common for organizations to designate a senior member as an official spokesperson for the sake of having consistent messaging. But I believe that to truly represent the diverse voices of international solidarity and social justice, there needs to be a varied perspective. And the key is knowing when to step back and letting others share their knowledge and resisting the urge to speak for people, like Lauren was saying. These practices invite radical imagination and growth. We need active and respectful listening to ensure that historically marginalized communities can self-represent and challenge established practices, reclaiming narratives that colonialism has often appropriated or suppressed. And I noticed that within the sector, there is an increase in buzzwords like decolonization, which has gained popularity recently, in some ways more popularity that has sidelined the narratives of feminism per se. But I think it's essential to understand that decolonizing something like communications is not a destination. It's an ongoing journey. You're never going to decolonize something. You're always decolonizing actively. And I think this journey requires recognizing colonialism's deep-seated impacts, engaging in continuous self-reflection, and prioritizing the self-determination of communities rather than wrapping our communications up in the new buzzword of the time to stay relevant. Also, as Amanda stressed, inclusivity and language. I think overly technical jargon is both colonial and inaccessible. We work in a diverse sector where communication barriers are plentiful. So emphasizing inclusivity means using plain language, reducing textual content in favor of having more images, and ensuring that alternative text and photo descriptions are provided. If a message is too complex for plain language, then I believe that it's best suited for academic discourse than spaces aiming to nurture transnational networks. And within that, and my last point, I think it's really important to consider how our role in international solidarity endeavors are tied to capitalist private sector requirements that silence our advocacy. This sector needs to, and I think I say this in every panel I'm on, but fundamentally examine and firmly reject the hypocritical relationship that we have with the corporate sector. I think the corporate sector and being funded by the corporate sector reduces what we can talk about, when we can talk about, and in which ways we can talk about it and what language we can use. So we can't talk about solidarity with land defenders, folks in the global south, and ethical communications in one breath while accepting funding from corporations who greenwash themselves with the next. If we're advocating international solidarity, we must stand firmly against oil, gas, and extractives, and those who enable and bankroll their violence against the land, against Indigenous people, and against women, girls, and LGBTQ+ people. Therefore, aligning our actions with our growing focus on language we're using in the sector of feminism, decolonization, and anti-racism in our communications must be met with ethical action. So I think when we're talking about ethical communication or ethical communication practices, I think those need to be directly tied to ethical action as well.
Amazing. I appreciate all these different responses from your different perspectives, but there's also some themes that are coming up. So a few of them is the fact that communication is dialogue. It's meant to engage people, so it needs to understand the audience, and we need to learn and adapt based on what our audience needs, how we communicate. A big thing that also came up around accessibility is the actual language that we use, and I completely agree with that. We kind of reinforce a north-south divide, or we reinforce existing inequalities when we're using a lot of jargon, a lot of acronyms, using words that are really challenging, whether that's because of educational gaps or you're speaking in your third or fourth language when you're using English. Things like that can become really challenging. So love to hear the ways that you're thinking about that in your communications work. And then the other thing that's interesting about communication is that it exists on all these different levels. You know, you talked about individual communication, but there's also kind of systemic or organizational communication that also works to reinforce those inequalities. So it's really interesting to hear how you're all approaching the question of ethical communication and considering it on these different levels. And this may add to this conversation, or you might take it in a different direction, but really curious to hear about our next question, which is focused on using technology for communication. So there's a bunch of emerging technologies that we have. Things like doing things on Zoom was less common 3 years ago, using social media, for example, engaging with artificial intelligence in order to create communications messages or interact in international cooperation spaces. So I would love to hear from the panelists around what are your thoughts on how emerging technologies are influencing communications in the work that you do. So I'll start with Lauren this time.
Yeah, I think that's a great thing to consider. And it's like ongoing, right? Because the digital space and these technologies are always changing and adapting, even ones that we've known to like, come to love, like Twitter, all of a sudden it changes so drastically. And so it is like an ongoing conversation. And, I guess Twitter is a great place to start because, when Elon Musk took over, it started all these questions about the ethical side of it and what was changing. And the conversations really snowballed. And then someone actually stepped up and was like, but we don't really consider the ethical side of other social media platforms like Meta. Like, why haven't we been talking about that before? Is that an ethical space? And it's true, right? Like when we're using these platforms, we kind of have to do as they want us to do. Like we're trying, you put out something and you're thinking about, oh, what is the algorithm like? And how do I make sure that we get the most amount of likes and we reach as many people as possible? And so we really have to remind ourselves that, the number of likes doesn't mean that, our value or our worth or our ideas is more or less important or successful. But that is hard. And it depends on, where you're coming from. Do you have funders that are demanding certain, reach or whatever, or when you're reporting back, what are the expectations there? I think that conversation is really important. And so I guess I'll say for our organization with the Twitter X kind of dialogue, we wanted to step off and away from X. It wasn't supporting what we wanted to be a part of. But then you have to be ready to justify that conversation to your funders later. Like, okay, our reach on social media is far less because we left because of this, right? So it's really challenging to try to just keep up with emerging technologies as is. And then also the more we learn, the more it impacts kind of how we continue to use them. But I will say for kind of emerging technologies, another thing, some of the work that I do is in video production. And so, the clipping of videos is far more popular now. So before you'd put out a video and you would say, this is the whole video and watch it start to finish. But now maybe someone clips 10 seconds and removes it out of context from what was before it and what was after it, and it can really get spun in a different way. So that's something that you have to consider kind of with the way technology is changing and how they want us to interact with media. And I think Amanda had mentioned in the first answer about capacity, there's so many different social media platforms and things. When Threads popped up, okay, are we all jumping on Threads? But do you have time? Do you have capacity? Do you have enough, like, within your day to get on Threads? So there are a lot of things to consider when we're exploring these technologies. I don't really have like a great answer for it. One of the things that I suggest is finding, even if it's 5 hours a month, that's kind of a R&D or research and development time where you maybe watch, I use Teams every day and this Teams update came out. I'm going to watch this little video about some of the new features of Teams. So you try to have, that little bite-sized amount where you can kind of learn one or two things. You're keeping up with what you have, but you're not, maybe don't get overwhelmed. Like, we're all trying to keep up our heads afloat. And so that would be my suggestion, is just try to find those little bits of time where you can set aside to dive in a little bit.
Fantastic recommendation. I work at a tech company and I still can't keep up with anything, and I feel very overwhelmed most of the time. So I can definitely relate to that, but also it kind of came back to a point that Brianna made, is like, we don't have to be perfect in this. We can still be learning and changing and adapting. And the most important part, I think, with technology is just taking that time to learn, because the spread of misinformation can be very detrimental to the work that everyone here is doing. And I'd love to pass it to Brianna to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on emerging technologies and communication.
Yeah, I think that it's very interesting because there is so many things that are changing, so many new platforms that are emerging. But I think that one of the most important things is being consistent, especially in the realm of international solidarity, understanding that there are certain platforms that are widely used by folks in the global south, and making sure that our messaging is still being able to be present on those platforms. But I think the increase in platforms and tools and avenues and connections, it's not just about the quantity of them, but it's also about how to use them to be inclusive. So I think that within VIDEA, we're seeing that our global south staff are able to participate as vital knowledge keepers on the global stage, in conferences and webinars, and so much more within the sector, because of the increase in digital platforms, and that digital presence is becoming more of a common practice. So last year we hosted a virtual youth conference where we facilitated the technology that was necessary on the ground to engage over 2,300 Zambian and Ugandan youth, and just about one of the most amazing and thought-provoking discussions on health, global solidarity, and gender equality. And I think these communicative forms are only possible with increasing knowledges that makes these initiatives more economically feasible for small organizations like ours. And I think that this breaks down some socioeconomic, language, and geographic barriers that have traditionally kept the voices circulating in international solidarity, those that are mainly white, heterosexual, and cisgendered, and that claim to speak for all. So truly like interrogating what democratizing voices in the sector looks like. And I think this also means that the days of saying that Global South folks cannot be on our staff and kind of relegating them to short-term consultancy positions or other unstable positions is over, which is a big yay, because emerging technologies gives us the tools to integrate more Global South folks as staff members and budget accordingly to support their participation through the use of technology. And I think with the pandemic, there was a huge shift to everything moving to online mediums with like so much accessibility and so much programming becoming online programming. And I think that this digital realm has become a space where, regardless of someone's geographical location, or where they are in the world, or their economic status, like there's potential for their voices to be amplified. And we're seeing this in VIDEA's Indigenous Climate Team when we're talking about the use of emerging, or not necessarily emerging because they're already established, but the uptake of like podcasts and videos and blogs and other mediums of resistance in this sector. Our climate team has been working on a climate justice podcast, which the absolute beauty in this is that it is a form of resistance through oral storytelling that is documented and can live forever as a symbol of Indigenous knowledge systems and intergenerational knowledge exchange. I think AI is a tricky one because it is evolving faster than I even know what AI is. And it's gone largely unexplored in our organization because where do you use it? It's changing every day. But I think that while AI is positioned as something scary in academia, for example, what I'm seeing, I think that it can be used ethically as a tool to like enhance our ability to communicate, like enriching our resources in a myriad in lots of languages, making sure that we're able to have resources that are plain language. And I think AI could be a way to start. And you know, before I came on here, I put a resource into ChatGPT and I said, rewrite this in plain language because I wanted to see what it would output. And I think that is a way to ethically use AI when we're deprogramming ourselves from being overly professional and using a lot of jargon. And so, yeah, I just think that there's more that we can do in an accessible way. And I recently taught myself Canva and Filmora for video editing to increase our accessibility in our communication. And I think like before, what would be a scary project of video editing, there are more resources to do it in a way that is not as overwhelming.
Incredible. It's two things really stood out that I think a lot of people are grappling with in this work. And one is around the breaking down of some physical or systemic barriers to participation. So whether it's someone who's unable to travel for whatever reason, not being able to attend these types of international events has broken down quite a bit because now we're doing a lot of things virtually. And I mean, for the folks in Canada, how many times have you invited a guest who couldn't come because their visa wasn't approved or because the process was going to take 4 months? And now there are fewer barriers to being able to participate actively. I wish I could see more of that happening. It's kind of, we have the platforms. Why aren't we allowing that more? But that's been a big part. And then the other thing around using AI, and maybe we'll dive into it more in the next question, but to be able to do more with less, especially in nonprofit organizations. For example, one time I created a youth program and translated it into 3 languages with ChatGPT. And then I obviously needed someone to help me out to ensure that they were all correct, but I was able to do that in 30 seconds, whereas before it would have caused our organization to have fewer resources or whatever it was. So it's a pretty interesting way to do that. But of course, there's other ethical considerations around ChatGPT and AI as well. I'll pass it over to Amanda to share a little bit more on your experience with emerging technologies in your work.
Yes, AI in particular has been quite a significant one. And both as like someone who uses communication and like consume it as well as give it to people, it's been quite significant. However, as someone who consumed it, as Sydney pointed out, there's a lot of people who use it to translate a bunch of languages, but a lot of the times they don't check the current language to make sure that it's correct, which then leads to deaf and hard of hearing to be like, okay, well, our language that you're currently speaking, that I'm currently reading, is not accurate by any means. But if I go to a different language, it is, because you use the resources to check that language, but not check the English one before translating. That has been a relatively different conversation where people are realizing that, okay, yeah, we can use it to do like translate to this language, do it to this, do it to this, but forgetting that there are still people who need it in the current language that you are presenting in. So there still has to be a conversation in which people who are unable to access it in the same way still get the information, as well as auto captions have been a huge rise due to virtual meetings, which I am not currently using. I'm actually using Cart, which is why I'm staring at the screen right next to me, because someone is so kindly paid to caption this for me so it is as accurate as possible and I could participate very easy compared to if there was auto captions. I'm pretty sure I wouldn't understand a single thing my fellow panelists would say, and it'd be very hard to contribute to the same conversation. So that is one of the biggest things that, while yes, it is great, as my fellow panelists have said, you do still have to review the information that is being developed, I guess is the word. That I do not have the actual word at the top of my head. But in a sense, double checking to make sure that the caption that got auto-generated is correct. If not, update it. double checking to make sure the alternative text, which I've seen alternative text get audio generated and I have no idea where it went. It was like, I don't know what universe it went to, but it was pretty like, that's not what the image is by any sense. So a lot of the times you kind of have to evaluate, is this tool actually useful for what you need to do? So if, for example, if I need to caption a whole video, which I have done many times, and usually auto-generate it, and then edit accordingly to make sure that it's correct, and that's in the correct format that's easy to understand, instead of assuming that, oh, it got like 90% of it correct, I'm pretty sure someone will figure it out. So, because chances are, if you are not the white cis men, usually, even the females kind of have it, if you have an accent, if you voice is a little high pitch, if the audio is not right, it will not say anything that you say correctly. So it's very careful to be mindful of what AI is technically using the data for, where is that data coming from to inform what you're seeing, instead of, oh, it should be fine, like that should be good enough, I hope, because I don't have time to look over it, which tends to be the biggest problem that we have. We don't have capacity to look for it. So that is, while it can be useful and save me half the time it would take to type the whole thing up, maybe it might take double the time to make sure that it's correct, that you may ended up having to do it from the beginning. So that's a lot of the changes that I have seen, as well as due to many platforms keep updating. For example, Zoom is one big example. You have to actually manually turn on closed captioning, even the automated one. In other platforms, it's there. You don't have to turn it on. So when I see a meeting that's for Zoom, I'm like, hi, do you have captions? Because if you don't turn it on before the meeting, I don't have it, even if it's audio generated. So those are like the typical communications that has to be aware of, understanding the platform, but also understanding and being able to evaluate it. Hey, is this working now for us? Is it something useful? If the barriers, is it something that we can fix without too much time? Or is it easier to outsource this or do it with the amount of time because we realize that doesn't take that much time? So those are kind of the shifts that I've seen, of just people kind of using AI as like, oh, now I can do these accessibility considerations, not realizing that it's not up to the standard that is expected. So that is something to be very careful and considerate of when viewing these emerging technologies that pop out of nowhere, and constantly being educated. And a lot of times when they first release it, for example, Threads, no alternative text, no captioning, none of the accessible consideration came in its launch, even though it's Meta and they had Instagram and Facebook. So those are very careful things to be careful of when doing it. And that's what I have seen. That you just have to be mindful of what you're using.
Absolutely. And I think this leads us really well into our next question. But before I go into the next question, I just want to point out to the audience, you are also welcome to ask questions in French or in English. Please do use the chat or the Q&A function to share anything you'd like to ask to the panelists. We'd love to hear what you're interested in learning about from these three incredibly knowledgeable folks. So please do put your Q&As into the chat or the Q&A function. But while I let everybody think on that and think on everything here, we have a third question that feeds really well into, Amanda, what you were just saying. And it's around what are the ethical considerations when we're using these emerging technologies. So one thing that you mentioned that's definitely been my experience with AI is that it kind of reinforces the same biases that we see everywhere else, right? The knowledge that it's pulling from is what is the dominant knowledge within Western culture. And since Western cultures are creating it, that's going all around the world, right? And how do we not make sure that it reinforces those biases? But then I'd also be interested to hear around how AI can manipulate what we see and manipulate what we consider to be real, right? There's been concerns around, for example, non-consensual distribution of intimate images from people creating AI images of partners and sharing that technology, or using voice altering technology to pretend to be someone else. These are very scary things that these emerging technologies are really impacting in the way that we communicate and how we essentially alter a reality or privilege a certain narrative over other ones. So I'm really curious to hear how, in the three of your work, are you encountering these things? How are you addressing these ethical considerations and this bias within communications and emerging technology? I'll start with Brianna this time.
Yeah, I think the question of AI is something that is still so very much ongoing to the way that it influences the ways that we work. And I think that as you were speaking, I was trying to think of the best way to articulate this or to say this. And it might be that AI's ethical use is to enhance, not to create, to enhance something that needs to be verified. Because as Amanda said, I tried to do AI captions on a video for a project, and I should have just did it myself, because the time it took to redo it was almost, I think, probably the equivalent of the time that it took to that it would have taken to actually write it. But I think that when we're talking about ethical considerations, there's like a lot of vulnerabilities that are challenging our ability in this sector to create safe community spaces, and like, not to draw inadvertently onto Spider-Man, but I think that with the power of technology comes great responsibility. And I think while platforms provide the tools for us to use, we have to continually reflect upon who holds the accountability for the outcome of our communications. How can we ensure that our messages don't unintentionally harm or misrepresent the international in our solidarity endeavors? And within Videa, we've seen the effects of things like Zoom bombing that happened to one of our events about a year ago, which is just disruptive action that is meant to target marginalized communities, is meant to target radical spaces of advocacy. And these disruptive trolling and Zoom bombing, like, they can re-traumatize people who are trying to participate and take what is supposed to be a space of radical resistance within the sector and turn it into a really unsafe environment. And so I think we have to realize that some of the issues that are coming up with technology, they're not just technological issues, they're deeply rooted in societal power dynamics, and power is really important. And some of the examples that Sydney said about the use of AI as a weapon against people, that is also rooted in the way that society views women and gender diverse people and the humility assigned to certain things. And so I think it's also important, and somebody mentioned this earlier, but to understand that even though there's emerging technologies, things are changing, the digital divide still remains one of the most pressing ethical challenges. So while technology, as I've mentioned before, can promise this big global community, not everyone actually has equal access to this community. And that is the result and ramifications of enduring colonial violence. And I think in our pursuit of global solidarity, we have to recognize that many people are still denied the basic rights to digital access, further perpetuating cycles of inequality. And so within Videa, when we're working with our staff in Zambia and Uganda, we provide a lot of flexibility in the workspace, recognizing that internet connectivity can drop at any minute, and that these are issues that should not be a deciding factor of whether or not someone is equipped to work in this sector. Connectivity issues does not determine who is a knowledge keeper. And I think that it's important that with these increasing technologies, that we don't lose sight of the need that for still having physical resources and communicative networks and relationship building that's offline. So I think like with all this, like understanding what ethical communication means, I think it's treating our online spaces as continuously trying to establish virtual communities that are built on care, reciprocity, love, and nurturing, where cultural sensitivity is a non-negotiable. I think the digital realm should be a place where people and cultures and different knowledges are respected and celebrated and not tokenized or appropriated in our attempt to make everything feminist or make something decolonial. It's all of those efforts take a lot of work and a lot of strategic engagement that is led with care and love and our hearts. And so I think every interaction that we have in these virtual spaces should be seen as an opportunity for genuine community building, where diverse voices are heard and valued, and not just a way to showcase.
I love those reflections. I'm going to pass it to Amanda again to talk a little bit about these ethical considerations. I would love to hear how you may have overcome some of these things using emerging technologies, and what would you recommend, for example, to the audience if they're looking to use these technologies more ethically?
Yeah, a lot of what Brianna said was quite resonate as well, like realizing that a lot of these things happen because there are vulnerabilities. These already exist. They're just exacerbated by the ease of access to digital technology, the fact that it can happen anywhere and it doesn't necessarily have to happen in a physical space. And a lot of it is like the decisions of people, the choice that someone made to do and to communicate in such a way, and the way that we also have to be mindful of the decisions and the limitations and the gaps that we see in these digital technology, in hopes to create that, inclusive, to create that kind of welcoming environment that doesn't create those restrictions, those barriers, that feeling of not belonging, not feeling respected because of those barriers. And this kind of does happen quite often due to decision making in the process, in terms of how exactly to set things up as well. Not everything's in control, but for some of the things in control, for like on my end, where I would like to attend a virtual event, I would love to participate, to ask for accommodation, the process of accommodation, just that alone, the thought of doing it tends to prevent a lot of my peers from not doing it anymore. They're like, I'm done. A lot of my peers don't necessarily have the same access to technology, that I am talking to my phone right now because it's my only sense of microphone, due to the fact that I had a huge increase of technology changes and I now have to make up for the stuff that I lost. So this is my replacement at the moment until I get an actual microphone that works with my devices. So things like that, where the unexpected barriers that happen at any moment for someone, that all of a sudden things change, or the decision to not follow through with someone if they ask a question about accommodation, if they ask if their needs are going to be met, if they're even been able to get into the digital space because those things are not there for them. So being mindful of the decisions that go behind selecting those technologies, looking into those emerging technologies, like evaluating, like, is it right for us? Does it have the thing that we need? Does it have the flexibility that we need to still include people? It's a lot of what I see and a lot of what I have to make on my end as a decision for communication, to make sure that people that need to see it, people that want to see it, because it doesn't need to be a need, it's just people want this communication. they are able to get it in a way that they can consume it as well. And they're able to provide it back, and we take it and make it better. And that's what I see as kind of like what we have to consider in an ethical way of making those decisions as well. Yeah.
I love that. And I hope you're able to see all the hearts going up in the chat, because it definitely resonates and it speaks to that part of communication, which is to amplify, right? That not everybody is going to be able to communicate to everyone, but if we can take these learnings and these messages forward, even as simple as hearing what you're saying right now, and then when participants go back to plan their own virtual events, that they're thinking about these things as well. So love those reflections, and I love how everyone's sharing those experiences. I'll pass it to Lauren as well to share the work that you're doing around ethical considerations for emerging technologies.
Yeah, I think Amanda and Brianna had amazing comments and reflections on that. So I won't spend too much time, but I will just, for an example, we did have an event on the ethical use of images in the international sector. And so this was kind of like before even AI was sort of an issue, where we don't know how those images are going to be taken and used, you know, outside of our scope. But one of the organizations had noticed that their participants, who were young girls mostly participating in their program, they would be having their picture taken, you know, to use on their website or on their social media, or to, you know, gather donations or whatever. And they found that this put them in very bad situations. They noticed high number of, you know, trafficking issues had arisen. Their pictures on their website had been stolen and being used nefariously. And so they made a conscious decision to not show any participants' faces as they were taking their pictures. And, you know, they even say this is a little bit more challenging. You have to be creative. How are you taking these pictures? But they also found it quite exciting, and it let them, you know, be a bit more creative and show different parts of their program that they were super excited about, or that were really successful, without just having the default, you know, a couple children working on something and showing their faces. And I thought that was super incredible, and that they had had that reflection themselves and had implemented those own guidelines in how they want to go forward. And we also at our organization have been doing that as much as possible. You know, we go into schools sometimes to do programs, and although, you know, kids here in Winnipeg are very used to having cell phones and taking pictures and sharing them everywhere, that's not something that we want to do on their behalf, because we don't know what happens to those photos. So now thinking about AI and how we're contributing to this like pool on the internet of photos, that's just another layer of being safe and being considerate as we, you know, approach AI and the ethical future. So just a comment.
It's a phenomenal reflection. I think, especially in international cooperation or international work, the objectification of people and images is huge, a huge problem. And that will only be reinforced by artificial intelligence, like you said. And so really thinking of people as people instead of somebody that's going to get you donations or somebody that's going to in need of help is very important. So I love that example. We have quite a few questions coming through, so I think I'll move over to the audience questions. And the first one, it looks like Brianna, you spoke to it a little bit, but we can dive a little bit deeper. But the question is, have any of the panelists had experience in successfully mediating opposing views within a specific marginalized group? I'm sure that there's diversity regarding the use of AI too. We know that one classical tactic used by colonialists everywhere is divide and conquer. And the example that Brianna mentioned is trying to create a divide between Indigenous peoples and immigrants to a country, for example, and how does using emerging technologies reinforce that divide in some way? And how have you been able to overcome that, I guess, in your work? Does anyone want to tackle that question first?
Can give it a punch. I think that with the increase in technology, there's also understanding what even is an algorithm, and how we do get put into digital silos where we only see what reinforces our own values. And I think that what that is doing is creating spaces where there is such radically opposing views. And I want to say approach those conversations with care, but at the same time, people who are actively confronting the effects of racism, colonialism, and a capitalist system, asking them to be calm and to hear a person out in that situation is just another way of, I think, dictating how people who are marginalized should talk about their own experiences. So I think that question, it's interesting because it's a wonder of like, how do we mediate these spaces while also not asking marginalized people to concede to making people who are confronting them feel comfortable. And I think like one of the things that I had for the next question, but actually understanding where that conflict comes from and who gets to participate in seeing a vast array of perspectives and ideas. One of the things that I was going to mention is our staff in Zambia and Uganda don't have Wi-Fi. They buy data. And so when we are putting out communications that are very large in size and videos that are very large in size, then we're actually requiring people in the global south, in order to connect with our messaging, to pay for it, because they have to pay for the data in certain amounts that isn't unlimited like here. So I think like even being able to participate in these spaces that have radical views or being exposed to both sides, that's also a privilege that people who have extensive access to the internet get to have.
Fantastic reflections. Does anyone else want to add to that conversation or any experiences from your own work that have come up?
I can't think of anything just off my head here, but Brianna did mention about, on social media or like Google, it knows you and it gives you what it knows you want, sort of, right? So it's hard to find opposing views sometimes. And so something that I really try to do is make sure that you're getting news from different sources, like, seeking out things like that. And one of the other things that I implemented at MCIC is, with our social media team, like, we have a communications person and they were in charge of social media, but I actually kind of put all of our team on it and they kind of assigned them a day. And so each person, has different interests and they will seek out those things. And that helps us diversify a little bit about what we're looking at and what we're interacting with, as opposed to one person who maybe, is very focused on one specific thing. So it is tough. And it's something that I think we have to intentionally do, is look for those opposing views and those different points of views. And it definitely does take more work. But I think that's just part of, making sure that we're working in the communication space as ethically and inclusively as possible.
That actually reminds me, I feel like this was a buzzword before, was echo chamber. Like, you are only seeing content that you want to see or relate to. And so as a result, there's a bunch of these narratives that are being excluded, some of them that you may want to see, and other ones that are directly opposing what your lived experience is, not even what you think, like literally what your experience is. And so it's really interesting to hear that tactic. I hope the audience is taking that back, of having different people engaging so your algorithm isn't trained to a single person. Another thing that I do is I turn off my microphone in a lot of my different settings on my app so that it's not hearing random conversations that I'm having or things like that. Obviously, my algorithm is still influenced by plenty of things because it's very sneaky, but at least I can limit some of the things that it's hearing or picking up on, so that you're not getting fed the same narrative over and over. So really great tactics. Amanda, did you want to add anything on your experience or how you've dealt with this in your work?
Don't really have a lot of experience with it. I am used to opposing view of accessibility, to thinking that this is okay and this is the standard we should appreciate, because that's what corporations want us to believe, due to this is the technology we're giving you, we're being kind. And so it kind of creates this, like, this is the standard that we think we should be in. And that creates a lot of opposing views of like what people think is okay and what people think it should not be. There's also the idea of like we all have unique experiences that creates our own frame of reasoning and understanding and beliefs. And a lot of times we don't know other people's situations that shapes the reasoning for reacting a certain way or needing certain technology, needing whether it's physical assistive technologies or digital technology. And so these type of things kind of fuel this like opposing thing we are trained to believe, to view it from our point of view, instead of, okay, here's my point of view. What else is different? What am I not seeing that happen? So in that case, like, that's kind of how you train yourself in communication to think ethically, because you're all of a sudden like, okay, I don't want to think about what I'm seeing. What are other people seeing that I could include in, or what I need to be considerate of that could potentially be harmful to others? And so in that type of understanding, you're able to like have a more broader, but it is very hard to find sometimes when you're just fed the same information, or you're like me and you choose to limit it just due to the amount of sheer information that you can easily consume. So a lot of times just reducing it can help and just go back to physical reality. But a lot of times just seeking out this information and knowing what questions to ask.
Definitely. I think one of the things that you mentioned was you gave the example of closed captioning and it being 90% correct, which I honestly have never even seen 90% correct when it's auto-generated, especially if you switch to any other language other than English. So I think that it's a really great point. And because I work in a tech company, I grapple with this quite a bit with colleagues or other people, is to say we're reinforcing the idea that 70 or 80 or 90% is enough for people to be able to engage when it shouldn't be, right? We should be striving for the 100% and that we can make this inclusive for everybody. And I think for the question, it kind of reinforces that popular opinion, exactly like you said, that, well, shouldn't you be happy with 90%? Because at least it's not zero, you know? And I think that that's a big problem that we hear a lot, and that people, you know, a message for all of us here is we shouldn't be satisfied with that. And we should use our voices where we can to say, this is not sufficient, this needs to improve. And we will use other platforms that do this better if you don't make that change yourself. Yeah, Brianna, go ahead. Love this.
Yeah, I think just thinking of an experience I had last week, as someone who is neurodivergent, emails are the bane of my existence. I don't like emails. My organization utilizes WhatsApp a lot, which I like that fast-paced communication. But I'm part of a different community that likes email threads, lots of them, multiple in a day, and I just can't keep up. And going to what Amanda was saying about, you know, that conflict when you bring up your accessibility needs, where I was like, is there any way that we could maybe make a Slack or make something that is, I can trace the 3 email threads that are about one thing? Can we do that? And getting a long email back that I will confess I have not read. I read the first 3 lines and I said, okay, this is not for me. But it was along the lines of, this is your job, which I don't get paid to do this, so this is not my job. But as a professional, you are supposed to blow. And I was like, no, as a professional, no. So I think, like, even though there's conflict in communications because of the topic, there's also so much conflict about accessibility, because having to challenge the way that things have always worked and always been done is really upsetting to people who have always done it and been doing it for a long period of time. So I'm a big fan of alternatives. I use a task tracker that my colleagues can look at because I want them to. That holds me accountable. That's a way that I use technology. But yeah, I think there is so much barrier when we're talking about like emerging technology and how we're using it and using different things, and but not being accessible to, or not being amendable to easy changes that can make spaces more accessible.
Yes, I love this one. There's like a moment from a panelist and someone else shares their experience. I love that dynamism in a conversation. So thank you so much for sharing your experience. And I think it actually touched on this question from the audience, which I don't know if we'll have time to cover fully, but you mentioned one of the questions was around what services do you recommend, or are there any things that you would recommend to improve accessibility? So you mentioned using a task tracker or communicating in ways other than email, whether that's WhatsApp or Slack or things like that. But if there's anything else that any of the panelists can think of, please do share them in the chat, or let us know if there's things that you would recommend to organizations who are looking to improve this. I think that there's a lot of different technologies that are out there, but sometimes they're really expensive or they're not accessible to everybody. So if you have any recommendations, please do share them. And we'll move to the final question. And I'm going to ask this question a bit of a different way to give you all the opportunity to plug the work that you're doing. So this question from the audience is, what advice would you give to someone wanting to start their career in the ethical communication sector? And I would love if you'd like to share some of the work that you're doing or anything that you would like people to check out, whether it's your Twitter or there's something that you're working on. I think it's helpful for people to see things afterwards. So please do share what advice you would give and plug any amazing work that you're doing. I'll start with Lauren for this one.
Oh no, I was hoping for an extra minute to think. I think it's a great question. I mean, I think to start in ethical communication, I think I mentioned it previously, like, just opening your eyes to different sources, different points of view. In Canada, CBC News is a very well-known thing, and you have the app and you have all this stuff, but that's not the only news source, and there's lots out there, and you get different perspectives from kind of the international side also. So I would highly encourage that, just diversifying what you're looking at, and different forms, even attending events like this and seeing what are other people doing, what's working. And yeah, like I think Cindy had mentioned about the closed captioning, and maybe you'll take that back now to when you put an event on and think about how can we make that better. So I think just if you're in communications, you got to kind of like get out there, right? Like you got to put your fingers in all these different pies and see what's going on, try different mediums. Even if you don't make videos, like watch videos. When you're reading books, like read lots of different perspectives, different genres. I think that really helps with communications, and to just be open to learning all the time. Like what you did, a year ago, now, today I've learned all these things and I would never write it the way I wrote it a year ago. Like that's great. That's cool that you can think about that and you can actually see that growth. I did mention earlier the Oxfam language guide, and so I will just mention really quickly, that kind of was brought up at MCIC where I work. We had a whole internal like lunch and learn discussion about it. Not all the words that they're suggesting or the new language resonated with us, and that was a great conversation too. Like, hey, this doesn't quite fit, and why not, and what would we be better? And so it's not that this guide should be your, go forward and just do everything that it says in it, but it's just to start having those conversations. But then based out of that, we actually created a campaign on Instagram on inclusive language. And so once a week for, I think it was 2 months, we posted a different inclusive language. And, this is why we want to say it this way, and a little bit of background about it, and to try to start that conversation. And so that goes back again to like searching those likes. Sometimes those graphics on Instagram don't go very far, but if a few people kind of pick it up and they start thinking about it, that snowball effect that I think has come up a few times is huge. And that's, I think, a lot about what communications is. So yeah, that's kind of a few little comments about just kind of reading and exploring and communicating in lots of different ways and seeing what other people are doing. And Amanda had said too, kind of thinking about the other perspective, what's like from the other point of view. So, oh, this makes perfect sense to me when I write it this way, but how would someone else interpret it or look at it? And I also encourage my team to get other people to read their stuff, like emails even sometimes. We spend so much time thinking about it and this makes perfect sense to me, but then when you're not that person writing it, you could kind of miss the point sometimes. So making that a common thing to do and just supporting each other and having those different perspectives, I think is all really important.
I love that. And yes, please check out MCIC and what they've done in terms of inclusive language. Great advice. And I think often in smaller organizations, you're not really trained in communications. You just kind of end up doing it as a result of like, we need to communicate what we're doing. And so I love what's been mentioned from a few folks is like, we don't need to have it perfect, right? We can learn. And as long as we take accountability to continue learning and adjust when we make mistakes, that's really important in ethical communications. I'll pass it to Amanda. Is there anything that you'd like to share in terms of advice and anything that you'd like to plug for the folks who are here?
Yeah, I think a lot of what Lauren said would be similar to what I would say as advice, because a lot of the time in communication, it's just constantly evolving, constantly changing. Like, all of a sudden, it's like there's an update, or there's a different perspective we need to consider. There's a different topic that now has become the hype that you probably should learn more about before, but now gives you the opportunity to learn about it. So that's kind of how communications end up working. And then the most important part is just to continue learning, to continue kind of challenging the system that we currently live in, kind of rethinking, okay, this is what we have now. What are other ways that we can do the same thing? Because chances are, if the other ways that you can do it probably is just as good as the current way you're doing it, but now you're including other people into the conversation, you're considering other perspectives. So it's nice to like play around to see what else you can do, what other ways you can communicate, what other things you may be missing. And sometimes maybe going back to the basics is something that needs to happen to remind ourselves that we're just here to share the message. We're just here to share, have a conversation, continue the dialogue of what is our mission, what is the change that we're trying to make and impact to others. So in order to do that, you constantly have to learn because it's constantly changing. Accessibility just constantly has new technology because they're now making it more widely available. But they also have technology that is super expensive that only certain people can access, but we may also need to learn and consider that could influence the widely accessible technologies that we do have. So to constantly learn, to constantly be able to want to do it, because really it is a want. If you feel like it's required, it's not really gonna feel motivating. So to be able to want to fuel the learning, to want to kind of learn more, be more inclusive, be more considerate of other people's experiences, needs, and what their place is at the moment is quite important. And that's kind of how I got into communication. Because even as for myself, I didn't exactly go into communication thinking I was going into communication. I sort of showed up and went, oh, cool, and stayed in it somehow, because every job has that form of communication that needs to be considered. This isn't just a communications person's job. This is kind of everyone's role that has to play in society. So that's what I end up learning, and I hope you take it with you as well.
I love that, Amanda. I love how you're channeling one of the skills, I think, if people are taking this back, is be empathetic and really follow through with what you're learning from being empathetic and making sure that you're including that in your work. I love that. And the final word to give to Brianna, I see that there's a ton of very cool resources that you've shared in the chat. So please do share your advice and some of the stuff you're working on.
Yeah, I think practicing humility is so important, and having I think that that's a guiding principle to be able to reflect on how we talk and how we communicate, is when having the humility to be confronted with the ways that the way you speak or the way you communicate may actually have unintended consequences. No matter how unintended they are, action doesn't always match impact, intent doesn't always match impact. And so I think practicing humility, but also looking around at your organization, and if everybody looks like you and talks like you and has the same opinions as you, then there might need some restructuring to happen, because your organization should not just be populated by people who think the exact same way as you. There's no room for imagination or creativity or growth in spaces like that. So I think making sure communication is a collaborative project, and I put some resources in the chat. One of them is a Connect with Kindness toolkit that our inclusivity team did, that also had a plain language social media post that went along with it. And also our digital smudge program, which was talking about kindness online and anti-Indigenous hate online. But I think that one of the things when we're talking about ethical communications is really just evaluating who is allowed to communicate for your organization, who isn't allowed. Are there people that you're not going to put up to speak on a panel like this for whatever reason? I think that those are super important, because in a community, if we're talking international solidarity and the objectives of international solidarity and the importance of community, then that means that there should be a diverse array of people who speak with and speak on the issues that your organizations are addressing. So yeah, I think ethical communications is anyone can do it. It looks different. If you look at these toolkits, you'll see that they're really accessible, large font, commentary about why things were included, and how different people who helped create them, what they thought was important. And so yeah, I think adding people to your communications, not just being like, according to a survey, according to our staff, but like actually saying, this person thinks that it's extremely important that we talk about this. This person is the person who brings this up, who makes sure that we are being held accountable to the values that we want. Yeah.
Can I just jump in quick before Sydney takes over? One of the things you said, Brianna, about how like, is everyone looking the same and thinking the same? You know that old expression, like great minds think alike? I had read this amazing article, which I wish I had handy, but it was on how great minds think differently and how it's great to have these different perspectives and to have different voices and points of view. So yeah, that made me think of that. And I loved that idea, and that just reminded me of it. So thank you.
I love that. And I think that's a good point to take back, is that you are an authority on the things that you know, the things that you experience, the things that you've lived. And you don't have to be super confident as a public speaker or do all of those things they've told you that public speakers need to do in order to still speak up. I know I consistently stumble over my words. I consistently say the ums and the ahs, and it's okay. You're allowed to do that. You're human. You're allowed to make those mistakes. So I definitely think it's easier said than done, but please do feel confident to come forward and share your story and share those things on things that you care about, because I think that we've been told to hold ourselves back if we don't show up perfectly, and that's very challenging to work through. But yeah, you can do it. You definitely can. Brianna, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that that's an extremely important point. Anytime that I speak, in person, I always start with saying, I'm really nervous right now. And I think like adding voice and adding feelings to the way you're feeling, that's what makes you an expert. That's what makes you a professional, not pretending like you know everything and have the answers to everything, but rather like right now, I'm nervous. And I had to remind myself and was a little bit reminded that I need to slow down when I talk, because I am so nervous all the time that I'm like, how much can I fit into a small amount of time possible? But yeah, no, that's made me think of that.
Love that. We're all public speakers. We're all going to go out and we're going to communicate ethically after this. So big shout out to everyone who came here to join this conversation. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much to the three of you for sharing your experience. So valuable, so practical. I just loved this conversation. I also want to shout out the ICN crew who put this together and brought us all here. Thank you so much for having me. It was such a privilege to be part of this conversation. And also want to shout out the interpreters as well, because I know it's a hard job, but you do fantastic every time and make this conversation available in French and in English. So I really appreciate you as well. I will pass it over to Judy Annette to close us out, but thank you so much everyone for having us.
Thank you so much, Sydney, and thank you so much to our amazing speakers. I have so many notes. I was taking notes, so thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. I think to close it off, Mateo will put a tiny poll there for you. Please just take a minute and tell us how you think we did today. And yeah, I hope we'll see you in our next event. Thanks again, Sydney and Jean and Fanny, for all the good work that you're doing. And yeah, also you can follow the speakers on all their platforms. We'll share them, and you can follow the ICN as well. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. And we hope to see you sometime soon.